Today we're reading The Sword in the Stone, which is a Disney classic. I loved this movie as a kid, and I showed it to you guys, and you did not like it as much as I did. I don't know why. A long time ago, the good King of England died, leaving no heir to the throne. But then a miracle appeared in London, the sword in the stone. Below the hilt were written these words: Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone, an anvil, is rightwise king born of England. Many tried, but none could move it, and in time the sword was forgotten. Without a king, the land fell into a dark age.
A dark age indeed, muttered Merlin, a wizard, as he returned to his house. He should be here. Half an hour, he said to his owl Archimedes. Merlin positioned a chair under a particular spot in his thatched roof. He'll be a small boy, Merlin mused, 11, 12 years old, and a scrawny little fellow. Sir Ector's son, Kay and Wart, lived in a nearby castle. Kay was Ector's firstborn, and Wart was Ector's adopted child, and the person Merlin was expecting. Suddenly a deer wandered into Kay's line of sight. He pulled his arrow back. Wart had climbed a tree to get a better view, but the limb beneath him crumbled. Wart collapsed on top of Kay, who misfired the arrow, sending it into the forest. Wart promised to get the arrow and ran deep into the dark woods. Wart found the arrow sticking out of a rotten tree above Merlin's house. He leaned with all his might for the arrow, but the branch he stood on gave way. It sent him tumbling directly into a seat Merlin had prepared. "Oh, you're a bit late," Merlin said. "My name is Merlin. Who are you, my lad?"
"Oh, my name's Arthur," the boy replied, "but everyone calls me Wart."
"I have the power to see into the future," Merlin told Arthur. "This, for instance, is a steam locomotive," he explained. He poured a bit of hot tea into a hole in the back of the engine and plugged it with a cork. The train began to travel across the table. Wart was mesmerized, and Merlin declared he would be Wart's tutor. But Wart had to get back to the castle. "Very well," Merlin said, grabbing a suitcase. Merlin planned to go with him. He recited an incantation, and the items in the cottage shrank and paraded into his bag. Merlin smiled. "Now, don't you get any foolish ideas that magic will solve all your problems," he warned, "because it won't." And just like that, the boy and the wizard were off to the castle. Wart followed Merlin for a while until finally Merlin took in his surroundings and asked, "Well, what direction is this castle of yours?"
I think it's north.
"The other way," Wart said, pointing in the opposite direction. So they turned around. Eventually, they arrived at the castle. Merlin introduced himself to Ector and Kay, explaining that his magic was for educational purposes, specifically to educate Wart. Ector reluctantly agreed to let Merlin stay. "Oh, thank you," Merlin said. Ector led Merlin outside. "All we can offer is a room and board," Ector explained. He pointed to a dilapidated turret. "That's the guest room." A little while later, a friend of Ector's named Pellinor arrived with news from London. "They're having a big tournament," he said as he removed his gloves. "To the winner goes the crown." Ector patted Kay's back. "You could win it, boy," he said. As Wart returned to the kitchen with the dishes, Ector called, "Wart, lad, if you stick to your duties, you could be Kay's squire." The next day, Merlin, Wart, and Archimedes were out for a stroll near the castle's moat. Wart swung a pretend sword and dreamed of becoming a knight. But since he was an orphan, and knights had to be of proper birth, it wasn't meant to be.
Oh, I only hope I'm worthy of being Kay's squire. That's a big job too, you know,
he explained. Merlin nodded and then turned to the water.
Now, lad, when I said that could swim like a fish, I really meant a fish,
he said. Merlin waved his staff, and the next thing Wart knew, he had been turned into a small orange fish. In an instant, Merlin transformed into a fish too.
"You are living between two planes now," Merlin explained. "Every flick of your fin creates movement. Come on, let's get a rhythm. Right and left."
Wart started to get the hang of it. The two laughed, swam, and sang their way through the water. Until they came face to face with a predator fish. Merlin bit the pike's tail so Wart could swim away, but the pike flung Merlin into a knight's helmet, trapping him inside. Wart begged Merlin to save them with his magic, but Merlin wanted Wart to try something different.
Now, don't panic. Use your head. Outsmart the big brute," he called.
The pike was closing in. Knowing the predator was too big to fit, Wart swam through a nearby chain. The pike followed and got himself stuck. On land again, Merlin changed Wart back to human form. Wart returned to his duties in the kitchen and began scrubbing pots and pans. Suddenly, Merlin appeared.
Have you ever considered being a squirrel?"
Merlin asked.
"Now, there's a tiny creature with enormous problems. His life is hazardous, downright dangerous."
And after a brief pause, Merlin added,
"Well, would you like to try it?"
"Oh, I'd better not," Wart replied. "I've got all this work to do."
"Ah, what a medieval muddle,"
Merlin said as he looked around.
"We'll have to modernize it. Start an assembly line system."
He held his magic staff high and instructed the dishes to wash themselves. As the dish assembly line performed its work, Merlin and Wart snuck out. It's okay to make mistakes, right? We all make them. Soon, Merlin and Wart were squirrels in an oak tree and were jumping from one branch to another. A female squirrel scampered up the tree and took an instant liking to Wart. He was overwhelmed by her affection and couldn't figure out why she kept following him around.
"Oh, she likes you,"
Merlin explained, but she was the least of Wart's problems. Wart found himself hanging to a branch with a hungry wolf waiting underneath to make a meal out of him. The female squirrel saw that Wart was in trouble and tried to save him. The branch broke, sending Wart to the ground. The wolf trapped him, but the female squirrel bit the wolf's hind leg, and the wolf then chased her, and she tricked him into jumping off a cliff. Finally, Merlin changed Wart and himself back into humans. The female squirrel was so disappointed, she ran up a tree and started to cry. Wart felt sorry for her, but didn't know how to help.
"Oh, that love business is a powerful thing,"
Merlin said as they walked away.
"I'd say it's the greatest force on earth."
Meanwhile, back at the kitchen, the dishwashing assembly line had gotten out of hand. The cook alerted Ector and Kate Kay, who went to check things out. They were frightened by what they saw and began fighting the dishes and brooms to make it stop. When Wart and Merlin arrived, broken dishes were everywhere. Merlin stopped the assembly line, and the men accused him of using dark magic. Then they scolded Wart for abandoning his chores. In a final show of mean-spiritedness, Ector demoted Wart from being Kay's squire, and Kay sliced Wart's mop in half as they left. Merlin got back to teaching Wart in the tower the next day, and after a while, Wart stared out the tower window. I've always dreamed about flying, Wart said. Merlin snuck up behind the boy and changed him into a bird. For Wart's first flying lesson, Archimedes explained that they'd begin with a glide, and in an instant both birds were in the air. Wart was having the time of his life. Everything was going well until a hawk appeared in their midst. Wart flew as fast as he could, but the hawk was right on his tail. Wart pressed on, flying deep into the forest for cover, and he landed on the chimney of a small cottage and thought he was finally free from danger. But the hawk followed him. Wart tumbled down the chimney and into a fireplace of an old woman. She picked him up, and Wart explained, I'm not really a sparrow. I'm a boy. Merlin changed me with his magic. He's the world's most powerful wizard. Meanwhile, Archimedes peeked through the cottage door. He realized Wart was in Madam Mim's home. She practiced dark magic and was incredibly dangerous. Archimedes flew to get help. The old woman began to laugh. Why, boy, I've got more magic in one little finger, she explained, changing her size and shape with ease. Mim chased Wart around the cottage and eventually caught him. Just then, a gust of wind blew open the door. It was Merlin and Archimedes to the rescue. Mim challenged Merlin to a wizard's duel. In this battle of wits, the wizards would change themselves into different things and attempt to destroy each other. There were 4 rules. They couldn't turn into minerals or vegetables, only animals. They couldn't become make-believe things like pink dragons, no disappearing, and no cheating. After the wizards paced off, the battle began, and suddenly Merlin and Mim were changing into all sorts of animals: an alligator versus a snapping turtle, a rabbit versus a fox, a caterpillar versus a chicken, and a mouse versus an elephant. It was hard to keep track. Until a ram versus a fiery dragon. Things were looking bleak. However, Merlin had saved his best trick for last. Merlin turned into a germ, and Mim caught him. Sick and defeated, Mim headed home. As Merlin, Archimedes, and Wart headed back to the castle, Wart declared, "Knowledge and wisdom is the real power." When they returned, they found Kay and Ector preparing to leave for the tournament in London, but Kay's new squire had fallen ill, so Ector reinstated Wart. When they got to the tournament, Wart realized he had left Kay's sword at the inn where they'd stayed. Kay needed a weapon. Wart ran to fetch the sword, but the inn's door was locked. Wart was feeling desperate. Just then, Wart saw a sword sticking out of an anvil in a churchyard. Wart raced to it. As soon as he touched the sword, a mysterious light shone down on him. At first, Wart was frightened, but he persisted and pulled the sword from the stone. Wart returned and handed the sword to Kay.
Wait a minute.
Ector whispered, recognizing the weapon.
It's the sword in the stone.
Soon the whole tournament was buzzing with the news. Ward confessed that he'd pulled it out of an anvil in the churchyard, but no one believed him. Ector dragged Wart to the churchyard and placed the sword back in the anvil. Just as Wart was about to pull it out again, Kay stepped in, trying to free the weapon. But the sword didn't budge. Other knights from the tournament tried and failed, and finally Pellinor suggested that Wart should have a chance. Wart stepped forward and quietly grasped the hilt of the sword, and without effort, he slipped it out of the anvil.
This boy is our king, said someone. What's the lad's name?
A knight asked.
Arthur,
Ector answered.
Hail King Arthur! Long live the king!
The crowd cheered, bowing to him. Inside the castle, Arthur sat on his rightful throne. He was quiet, nervous, and even thought about running away, until Merlin showed up.
Boy, you'll become a great legend,
Merlin said as he helped Arthur put on his crown.
They'll be writing books about you for centuries to come.
And that's the end. That was abrupt. Good night. I love you.